right. So that was another amazing conversation. Again, I want to thank Mac and Kirsten for that. I'm going to go ahead here and switch over our fancy graphics really quick, and then I'm going to invite Annie up because we've got another conversation ready to go. So let's see. Here's Annie. All right. Hey, Annie,
Thank
how
you.
are you doing?
I'm doing awesome. How are you doing?
I'm doing really good. I have been looking forward to this conversation since we first connected a couple weeks ago.
Likewise, likewise.
Cool. Well, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell everybody who's watching a little bit more about you?
Of course. Well, first off, I just want to express my thanks for the opportunity to have a platform here to share my story and raise awareness. My name is Annie, and I've been living with anorexia, body dysmorphic disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder for over 20 years. And it's taken me a long time to feel okay saying those words out loud. So I think that alone speaks for itself. But today I'm specifically here to talk about my disorders, specifically through the lens of someone who was of Asian heritage. Um, and so just a bit of background about myself. I was born and raised in Los Angeles in a pretty Caucasian community, a pretty Caucasian part of town. And so for me growing up, I was usually one of maybe two, three Asian kids in any given classroom at any given time. So I never really felt like I fit in. I always felt like I looked different. The clothes I wore were different. Cultural backgrounds, holidays, traditions, foods that I would bring to school were different. And I think, as most of us can unfortunately agree with, when you're different as a kid, it's not really a great thing. And so there was a lot of taunting, bullying on the playground for the way I looked, essentially for who I was. And so I spent a lot of my childhood with self-doubt, low self-esteem, low self-image, and, just kind of dealt with that by myself. When I was in high school, a string of traumatic things just happened in rapid succession, none of which were related to one another. They were all just totally separate incidents. But over the span of 2 months, three different people in my life passed suddenly for different reasons. And looking back, what I know now is what I was going through was grief, depression, anxiety, and the beginnings of my eating disorder. I didn't know what I was even dealing with. I didn't have the words for it, and I just totally socially retracted into myself. I became really obsessed with food and weight and my body image. And so again, that was the genesis of my eating disorder. And, sometimes as these things go over the course of 20 plus years, it hasn't always been me at rock bottom. There have certainly been this fun wave of highs and lows over the years, including inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment, leaves of absences from work. But what brings me here today is that this is all part of my own recovery and healing journey. And I say journey because I do believe it's a journey. I think it's ongoing, and I think it warrants constant conversation. I just want to raise awareness, especially within the AAPI community, where this is a very silent topic for so many reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that. And there were many things that I could relate to, from the bullying to the suppressed grief and the suppressed pain. And I think that's why it's so important that we always have these conversations and talk about our lived experience so that people can understand that eating disorders aren't just about the food. They don't just develop one morning when you wake up and decide you don't want to eat XYZ. They're very complex mental health conditions that oftentimes there's many factors contributing to them. And from previous conversations, I've heard that in the AAPI community, especially, there's not a lot of language around mental health. There's a big stigma around mental health. So I wonder if you could maybe share from your experiences, what is the status, I guess you could say, of mental health in the AAPI community, and how openly is it discussed?
Wow, how much time do we have? It's a lot to unpack, but I think what I'll start with is just how taboo of a topic it is to even begin with. And so there's so much shame, stigma, and this notion of being a burden to your family or being some kind of stain or embarrassment. And so it's a very taboo topic. And so I think that already says enough, right? in terms of it's not okay to show up being your full self because we have this image to uphold. We have to be stoic. And so, there's this idea in our culture of also being stoic and not showing weakness. And so when I was a kid and I was being bullied and I would come home crying to my parents, complaining about the mean kids on the playground, it was dismissed, kind of like, it's not a big deal, just get over it and you'll be okay if you just get good grades and work hard. And I mean, that can only get you so far in life, right? What we need is support. We need validation. We need our thoughts and feelings to be heard. And I'm so glad that you raised communication as a topic because, for one, because mental health is such a taboo topic, I didn't learn how to even communicate that until I was in my 30s. And a good example of this is I'm Korean American and I grew up speaking Korean. And every Korean word I know, I learned in my household, except maybe the bad ones. My friends taught me those. But I don't possess the language to articulate words or concepts like mental illness, depression, grief, coping mechanisms. Those are conversations I have never had with my family unit before because it's not a topic of polite conversation. And part of me almost believes that there's this avoidance. Well, if we don't talk about it, then it's not there. And I find that to be pretty painful. And, again, there's so much to unpack, but I guess the last thing I'll mention here also is this very strong value that we have in our culture and heritage about the notion of duty and obligation to family and expectations and meeting these expectations. And as a child of immigrants who moved here from Korea, for those of us who are first generation, what's hard is wanting to respect the customs and traditions of our parents and where they came from. And I do get it. They come from a different generation and time where mental illness wasn't discussed. There was lack of education and awareness. But we're also in a more modern society now. And I'm a Korean American living in America. And what I continue to grapple with is how to bridge that gap between honoring the customs and traditions of the past, but also learning to stand up for myself and take up space, literatively and figuratively, so that I can really show up as one me and not try to hide a certain half of me because of the expectation that comes from my culture.
Well, you're doing exactly that today. So thank you so much for sharing yourself and your story with us. It's very interesting because my husband's family is actually of Asian descent. So I
Mm.
have some interaction with that. And you're right, there isn't the language around mental health. And just listening to how his childhood was compared to mine, it's almost night and day when it comes to talking about our emotions or any of that, or also the obligation to family that you were talking about. So along those lines of expectations, though, kind of in Asian American culture and in Asian culture in general, what kind of expectations are there around body image?
Yeah, that's a interesting one and something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. But my parents moved to the U.S. from South Korea in the mid '80s, and at the time, the country was more economically depressed. There was less Western influence, and this is a broad generalization, but it is not untrue. But most people had a body type, and it was thin. And so for many Asian Americans, I mean, that's kind of the gold standard, right? It's you want to be thin and you have to be thin in order to be attractive and to attract a good husband and have a good fortune and a fulfilling life. And it's funny how quickly it goes from your body type to having an amazing life because me now, I know how untrue that is. So that certainly exists. Um, and the other thing that I think about that really, really isn't discussed enough is the notion of body shaming. And so, when I was a kid and I would go to these family functions, it would always start with people pinching your cheeks and grabbing certain parts of your body and commenting on, how large you'd become since the last time you saw them. And again, when I would go home and cry and complain about this, it was just dismissed like, oh, it's not a big deal. Your aunt just does that. That's just the way she is. And what I find to be so cringy is how accepted and normalized it is. And We, as a society, as a culture, I hope we move away from the notion of focusing in on something that can be so triggering to a particular person. But it's this really unrealistic idea that a person needs to have a certain type of body to be a decent human who gets to take up space in the world. And I've just always had an issue with how normalized it's been in our culture.
Yeah. Yeah, the weight stigma and the stereotypes that exist there, it's disheartening. And
Hmm.
I know also in your culture, the relationship with food might be a little bit different too. Food is a very social thing. It brings us together around holidays or get-togethers and stuff. So I'm curious, in your experience, what was maybe like with your family and stuff around food or the relationship there?
Yeah, we were talking about communication earlier, or maybe the lack thereof. And so in our culture, I will say it's very uncomfortable for most Asian people to say to their family, parents, etc., "I love you." That's such a weird, icky L word. I mean, it's something that we don't really do. And so, how do we communicate in the absence of using language? It's through food. And so for us, food is a huge love language. And I think this transcends Asian culture. In ours, I think part of the problem is it takes the place of language. And so if you show up on any Asian person's doorstep, honestly, before they even greet you and say hi, they're probably going to ask you, "Have you eaten yet?" And it doesn't matter what the answer is, yes or no. You will probably be invited in, you will probably be fed. And the polite thing to do is to accept it and consume large quantities of it. And that's your way of reciprocating and saying back, "Hey, thank you so much for showing how much you cared about me. And I love you too, by the way." So that what was tricky about that for me in my experience with anorexia is this notion of rejecting food. And so growing up as an adolescent, still living in my parents' household, there was a lot of conflict around the dinner table. And there was a lot of guilt. There was a lot of shame about, why can't you just eat this? Why is this hard for you? And so put so much time into preparing this. Why can't you? Dot, dot, dot. And for me, it was challenging for a number of reasons. And what I've come to realize in the years since then is that food again is a love language, and my actions of rejecting that food was kind of me rejecting the love that was being expressed to me, and that's something that I really didn't realize until many years later. And so, thinking about how do we resolve something like that, I think education and awareness are key. And so for me, what's been really helpful is sharing my why, which is to say, these are the reasons why this has been difficult for me. And in doing so, what that has done to some extent is to help absolve me of some of the guilt and shame that I felt, because I felt like a horrible person. I felt like some degenerate who couldn't speak this love language. But, it's learning to express my own needs. It's learning to express where I'm coming from. And I do believe that to some degree, we have to meet each other halfway, right? And so I want to make sure that I'm communicating what I need. And I do hope that from the other side, there is some semblance of understanding. And that's how we really start the dialogue. And I will say none of this happens overnight. Again, it's a process and it's a journey.
Yeah. Yeah, so well said. Because there definitely is a lot of places where we need to learn to meet each other in the middle again. And I think, yeah, there's no, it's not black or white again. There's not one side or the other. And as you were sharing that, it made me think of a personal experience I had where we were at a friend's wedding, and her family is from South Asia. And her mom kept, offering us food and offering us food. And at one point I said no. And like my husband's like, "What did you do? Like you just offended everybody." Like I had no idea about this. But just imagine me sitting there, like I've got the eating disorder voice in one ear, and then I've got this feeling that, oh my gosh, now I've let everybody down and I've offended people in the other ear. So I can only imagine there's just that internal conflict that you must feel in those moments.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, so I guess moving ahead in your recovery, what has recovery looked like for you? What has this healing journey looked like, and maybe what are some obstacles that you've had to face along the way?
Yeah, well, the obstacles were certainly, again, the kind of lack of communication. And so when I think back to me as an adolescent, I didn't even possess the language to know what I was going through, which meant I really couldn't ask for help. And beyond that, there was also just the almost the embarrassment of like, oh, how could I even approach somebody about that and show this weakness? I'm supposed to be stoic. I'm supposed to be capable. I'm supposed to be competent. And how dare I show this weakness? So it took me years before I even sought treatment. And it was in my mid 20s when I hit rock bottom. I was in a job that I hated. I felt like I deserved to be in a better place in life. I was in a relationship that felt ingenuine, and I was just kind of grappling with purpose, identity, and who I was. And so my ED really hit the lowest of lowest points. And I was fortunate in that I had a friend whose mother was a nurse, and she helped me see that I really needed some emotional and physical help. And so with her help, I checked into an inpatient program and got the help that I needed there. And what was interesting at the time was I worked at a mental health clinic, and I didn't tell a single person what was going on or what I was going through. I disappeared for a couple of weeks and came back and like truly pretended nothing happened. And you think of all places, if you're working in a mental health clinic, that's maybe the right place where you can feel safe sharing that with folks. But at the time, I just mentally wasn't there. um, 3 years ago, I hit rock bottom again, and went took a leave of absence from work. And that time, I told everybody and anyone who would listen, whether it was friends, coworkers, people in my community and network. And I have to say, the most interesting thing about that is that I have spent decades of my life trying to keep these two images separate. This is ED me, and this is professional me, and these two people cannot coexist. And when I allowed those two people to become one, and I started sharing my story very publicly in the workplace, it was the weirdest thing. It invited the love, support, and community that I had been looking for my whole life. And if I had told 5-year-old me that, man, it's okay to be you and you can show up as your full self, and if people don't like it, that's a them problem, not a you problem. I don't want to say my life would have been so different, but things could have been a little bit different. And so for me, well, it's been really the most remarkable part of my healing journey is this learning that with self-acceptance and being kind of unapologetic, I've actually found that people actually do accept me for who I am after all. And it's kind of mind-boggling after trying to be so many things I wasn't. I was trying to be white, I was trying to be taller, I was trying to be skinnier, I was trying to be all these things. And at the end of the day, it turns out it's just being me was apparently the most okay thing after all. What a lesson.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to say that I would play like a lot of different characters, and the hardest character to probably play was myself
Yeah.
when I started to learn who my authentic self
Hmm.
was. And I was just reading a book the other day, and the author kept going back to his belief that what other people think of you is none of your business. And it's like that's kind of exactly the philosophy I want to take through life now is like I spent way too long worrying about what other people were going to think of me. And, at the end of the day, there's going to be some people who don't like me, and there's going to be other people who love me, and I can't control that. I can just be me and let everybody else, make those decisions themselves.
Totally.
So, as we're as we're about 10 minutes out, another question, and it's been a question that I've asked pretty much everybody so far today, but what is one thing that you would want everybody to know about an eating disorder?
Oh yeah. Wow. One thing. Maybe this has been offered by a bunch of other people, but I think it's really important to shine a light on it. It's that you're not alone. You're not alone. And part of why I'm speaking out is when I was young and vulnerable, I really needed somebody who looked like me to stand on a public platform and share their story and say, it's okay to be you. It's okay to have mental illness. And it's not something that you have to hide. And so part of my journey has been sharing my story with other people. And what has really happened in the aftermath of that is this outpouring of private messaging from people out in the community saying, wow, I've been through, like, your story is basically the same as mine, or somebody in my family is going through something, or somebody in my community is going through something. And so eating disorders are sneaky things, they're out in the community and they're so silent. And that's a terrifying thing because of how damaging they can be, not just for the physical body, but emotionally. Just the amount of emotional years that I feel like I've lost just being withdrawn from society, being unable to engage and participate in fun things because my ED was so overpowering and loud. And so, if I can cheat and do another kind of one and a half things here, it's that there's life outside of an eating disorder too, and it's silent, it's there, it's hidden. But I believe that by sharing stories, creating platforms, elevating our voices, that we can break the stigma and invite more community. Because I feel like that's the beginning of where the healing really starts.
Yeah. Wonderfully said. Wonderfully said. And I'd even give you a second point if you if you wanted to, because that was so amazing. What advice would you have for someone out there right now who's struggling, who maybe they don't know how to start that conversation? Maybe they've got a loved one that they're concerned about and they don't know how to approach that conversation. What would you say to them?
Yeah, this one is one that I have a hard time expressing, but I do want to be really frank and forthcoming about it. But when I first started my recovery journey, I expected to find support in certain places. And that is to say, within my nuclear family, within my network of close friends. And it was disappointing in the beginning, but now I've come to an understanding and there's been forgiveness and all that. But I think my lesson would be seek community where you find it. And so for me, in the very beginning of my journey, when I went inpatient, I remember my parents dropping me off at the hospital when I was inpatient, and I could see them as the double doors were closing, and they just kind of stood there and cried and waved. And truthfully, I felt abandoned. I felt like, wait, that's it? You're not going to be part of my journey with me? We're not going to do family therapy? And it took me a really long time to forgive them for that, because I felt like you didn't walk this walk with me. And what I realized in hindsight was they were going through their own difficulty. They truly were going through their own painful journey of how could this have happened? What can we do? They did not possess the communication, the education, and awareness of what they could have possibly done to help me at that time. And so, what I want to say to folks out there is that's okay. That's okay. And for me, I have found community elsewhere, this lovely community here today in my workplace, with friends, with members of my extended family. But, I guess one bit of, not words of advice, but it's just in my own experience, what I found is I didn't find community where I would expect to find it. And so where you find it, hold on to it and embrace it, and let the people who support you love on you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all about finding your people
Mhm.
and find, yeah. One of the things that we're working on in the background right now is to try to find some individuals to get a support group going, whether it's a pop-up support group or hopefully one day a recurring support group for the AAPI community, because I know that's an area that you're very passionate about. And hopefully we'll be able to make that happen here pretty soon.
Yeah, for sure.
But
Yeah. And I think it's all about
in
I think it's all about finding opportunities, creating space, inviting voices. And I think in doing that, all of the stigma, the taboo, the cultural barriers, I think none of this happens overnight. But I think by fostering dialogue, normalizing the conversation, doing exactly what we're doing here today, I think that is how, over the course of years and generations, we can build an understanding. And again, I don't expect any of our parents in my generation to one day wake up and say, "Oh, I get it. I get it now." Unfortunately, we don't get the luxury of having that. And so, I do believe that if we continue to foster the dialogue, that's how we create change eventually in the world.
Yeah, amazing. And that's why we're having the day of conversation today, because I've said it time and time again already today. But this is just the start of these conversations. We're going to keep these conversations going throughout the entire year because they extend well beyond Eating Disorder Awareness Week. And I'm completely with you that we need to create more space to be able to lift voices up and different experiences up. Because you mentioned it a few minutes ago, but being able to hear somebody who sounds like you or see somebody who looks like you talking about your lived experience, that's what opens the door for others to heal. That's why it's so important that when you do get to a place in your recovery where you're comfortable enough with sharing your story, I encourage everybody to do it, because you never know who else out there needs to hear it right now. Like, our stories have power, and they can change lives. No matter what you've been through, no matter what you've overcome to get to the point where you're at right now, you've learned something, you've experienced something that could help somebody else out in their journey.
Yeah, and I guess on that note, it's the whole, it's okay to not be okay. We're perfectly human here, and we all have good days and bad days, and it's been a 20 plus year bumpy journey, and I will say it's looked like this and all kinds of stuff, and that's why we have community to show up for you and support you when you're feeling your worst, when you're fullest of your, self-loathing or whatever it is. That's what community is all about. We're humans, we're social creatures. This is why we're not people who live on islands by ourselves. And so I'm just going to make a shameless plug, but if and when the time comes to build this AIPI support group, you have my full endorsement and support. And I'd love to participate however I can, because we need more spaces, we need more platforms, and we need more places to shop from the rooftops.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's what I'm all about, is creating those spaces. So when you reached out for that, I was very excited, and it's something that we're actively working on.
Right.
So before we go ahead and wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just to repeat everything that I've said, which is to say, it's okay to not be okay. Find the community where you find it. It may sound like a funny thing to say, but forgiveness has been a really big part of my journey too. Just as far as moving past some of the, I don't know, I guess unresolved resentment and things that I had. But yeah, and I guess the final note and plug that I'll put in is, you deserve recovery. You deserve to live a full, happy life. You deserve to be free from the shackles of what an ED has on the stronghold of your life. And that recovery is possible after all.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Annie, it has been an absolute pleasure to share the stage with you this afternoon. And like I said, I look forward to keeping this conversation going.
All right. Thanks. Have a good one.